Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and we start out here to the southwest of Novomykhailivka, where to the southwest of the town yesterday the Russians launched an armored assault where they captured, or rather more accurately destroyed, the Ukrainian fortifications here by the forest line, and following that they have now advanced further southwards. This is likely due to the non-existence of these Ukrainian positions, allowing the Russians to take advantage of that and consolidate positions here to the west. And with this we see that the Russians did succeed with this armored assault despite the casualties that they suffered, and with this the Russians are now moving further westwards. This is following the Ukrainian counterattack that took place here to the north of that, so we are likely going to see further Ukrainian attempts at cancelling this Russian advance, as we've seen previously that they are interested in holding these positions here. And with this, there is one fewer Ukrainian fortification between the Russian positions here to the east and the Ukrainian ones to the west. And this is likely just an expanding of the Russian operations in the direction of Volodar. They may look to capture this road all the way to the Vodiane direction. And we may also see some operations coming from the south following these advancements, as the Russians would have an interest in expanding the front line, especially here to the east of Volodar, to try and cut off the main supply route in and out of the town, which has proven an unpenetrable fortress of the Ukrainians so far in this conflict. So we're seeing that there is these developments to the southwest of Novomykhailivka. As for the northeast, there's also been an advancement by the Russians, where they managed to recapture all of these positions after a Ukrainian counterattack. Yet again, we see the Russians trying to take advantage of the Ukrainian tactic, which is based on this active defense where they move around with the elite units. Well, this also means that once the elite units have left, that the in-depth defenses are weaker and vulnerable compared to prior, so they would take more casualties in a less defended area than a heavily defended one. So for every time the Russians capture a territory and then the Ukrainians recapture it, the position itself becomes weaker, and therefore the Russians will have an easier time recapturing it. So this is one of the weaknesses of the strategy. That is simply, if the Russians go in and pull out every time they attack a place, sure, the front line won't change much, but in the end, the vulnerability increases of the units fighting in the area. But now that the Russians are holding on to it, they are themselves in the weaker positions. And now they will be pushing further in the direction of Novomykhailivka. As such, we'll likely see further operations in a southwest direction now that they have reached the top side of Novomykhailivka, or at the very least close enough with only one field between the two. Based on this, we see that the Russians are putting a lot of effort here to the south after they pretty much stopped at the start of the month with this Ukrainian counterattack, which allowed the Ukrainians to recapture all outskirts of the town. We can see that the Ukrainians had put a lot of effort into holding the town with all of these fighting taking place, yet no real advancements by the Russians other than getting closer and closer to the town. We're seeing that they are at the outskirts of the southwest all the way to the northeast. With this, we see that the Russians will likely expand a bit further in a western direction, but that will allow them to encroach on the town from 3 different directions, or a semi-encirclement where they are close enough to hit the back supply line. And with that, we'll likely see that the Russians will continue in a southwest direction and essentially siege the town rather than actually infiltrating and storming it. Or based on the previous information we have on the Russian army attacking towns like this one, they will likely get a foothold somewhere while they are doing this semi-encirclement where they're hitting the supply line of the town. So far, they don't really have this semi-encirclement, as the Russians do not have direct fire control over all of the roads. We have one that goes through Pereskoivka here to the north, and even if they have fire control here, it's not direct as there's just that far distance between the two, but they're getting very close. The Russians will need to go further in a western direction to the north of Pereskoivka to get a proper semi-encirclement of the town. Other than that, there is still supplies coming in and out of the town. We then move on in a northern direction where fighting continues through the Avdiivka all the way up to the Bakhmut direction, where there's constant back and forth between the two sides, especially in the Bakhmut direction where there's been a lot of back and forth, where the Ukrainians have made some advancements in the north and the Russians in the south, and the Russians here in Avdiivka direction have made the most advancements while the Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the flanks. The Russians have been advancing towards the city itself. So this is again how they are trying to move around a lot where they started out in the flanks. Now they have pretty good positions on the flanks. They then focused on the center, and while they're focusing on the center, the Ukrainians are taking advantage of the lack of attention to the flanks and trying to counterattack to stabilize those positions. So there's this constant fighting taking place over pretty much everywhere at all times, and therefore it is difficult to keep tabs on everything that happens. Especially considering that the weakness of the active defense strategy is that although you have legionnaires going pretty much everywhere to defend any possible breakthrough of the Russians, the Ukrainians are still tiring themselves down by constantly being on the move. Since the Russians have so many soldiers available, they're able to concentrate at various points at the front line. But then again, there's a recent statement by Zelensky stating that the Ukrainians have 600,000 soldiers committed to the front line. This means that the Russians and the Ukrainians have equal amounts of soldiers at the front line. This means that neither side can concentrate their forces in one place without leaving another place vulnerable if everything else is equal. If the Russians and the Ukrainians have equal amount of troops on both sides of the front line at every single point of the front line, that explains exactly why there's a stalemate. So the question here is, which side will be able to mobilize faster than they are losing troops? And so far, with the lack of a new mobilization bill in Ukraine, it is likely that the Russians will outman the Ukrainians if they are losing men at a 1-to-1 ratio. We then move to the Lyman direction, or the Lyman front, where the Russians have made another advance and have negated many of the Ukrainian counterattacks. So with this, we see that they have gotten a significant foothold within the forest patches here to the east of Terny, as well as the forest lines here. So with this, we see that the front line is very close to both Terny and Novomykhailivka, while at the same time, the Russians still have their positions here to the east of Zarishny and Torsk. And with this, we see that it is likely that the Russians are getting very close to the next stage of operations, which is launching attacks towards the Terny and Novomykhailivka directions, as well as in the direction of Zarishny and Torsk. This raises the question, has the Russian operations so far in this winter simply been these positional fighting to improve their positions and then prepare for a larger scale operation? Based on the information we have so far, based on the frontline changes and so on, most of the fighting hasn't really been any large operational offensives, but instead simply some positional fighting to get closer to the Ukrainian positions. This has two possibilities. Either the Ukrainian defense in depth tactic is simply that powerful that the Russians are so slowly advancing, surely advancing, but very slowly, and the Ukrainians are able to launch these counterattacks with the active defense, which proves that the Ukrainians have a very strong defensive tactic, or the Russians have simply not been putting and committing as many troops as they want to into these operations to get a proper breakthrough. Both can be true at the same time, considering the previous statements. The Russians and the Ukrainians have a 1-to-1 ratio on the front line. This means that either way, the Russians cannot outman the Ukrainians at a significant enough point, to the point where the Russians will have such a significant advantage, like a 3-to-1 local advantage, to allow them to launch proper offensive operations. Therefore, if the Russians look to launch a proper offensive operation that will succeed and break through the Ukrainian defenders, for example, moving towards Lyman, taking Avdiivka, moving in the direction of Chesev Yar, which there has been some rumors that the Russians are planning an operation towards Chesev Yar, or simply capturing the Robotyne direction. Either way, they would need to concentrate enough soldiers in one place to be able to outman or outnumber the Ukrainians 3-to-1. That is the standard rule of war. For such an operation to take place, the Russians simply need to introduce a large enough reserve force that they can pour those in at one point. For example, there has been talks by Putin himself that the quote-unquote demilitarized zone needs to be expanded beyond the borders of Ukraine to the point where cities, which he calls peaceful cities, like Belgorod and Kursk, which are beyond the Russian border, therefore he calls them peaceful because the conflict zone is currently focused here in the southeast. With that, we see that the Russians want to expand this quote-unquote demilitarized zone to a point where the Ukrainians cannot strike Belgorod with artillery. And for that to take place, the Russians need to move the border here by Kharkiv towards the city itself, similar to what they had previously prior to the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. And for that to happen, they would need to launch an offensive there. If the Russians continue with this equal amount of soldiers on both sides in the southern front with 600,000 against 600,000, then the Russians simply need to introduce an additional 200 or 300,000 soldiers to that force and launch that attack towards Kharkiv or other areas here by the border between Russia and Ukraine. That will force the Ukrainians to spread out their forces beyond the southern front to these newer areas, which will leave the Russians in a significant manpower advantage in the south, giving them a full front line advantage of 1.5 to 1, which will make it very easy to get them a local 3 to 1 advantage anywhere at the front, because defensive positions can be allowed to hold fewer soldiers than offensive positions. For example, let's say 100,000 soldiers are in Zaporizhia and 100,000 against the Donetsk front. The Russians are on the offensive in the Donetsk front and in the defensive in the Zaporizhia front as a general rule. So in the Zaporizhia front, they can have or turn it down to like 60,000. And even if the Ukrainians add up to 120,000 here on their part of the front line, it'll only be a 2 to 1 advantage. They would need to concentrate a whole 180,000 to allow them to get a 3 to 1 advantage. And that is very difficult with the limited supply lines going through Zaporizhia to supply a total of 180,000 troops. Therefore, the Russians could relocate those 40,000 to the Donetsk front, and if they're able to relocate and have 140,000 troops by the Donetsk front, but at the same time, if they have defensive positions here in the Bakhmut direction, then they can take 60 or 40,000 from there as well. They'll put it at 180,000, and with the renewed built railways and supply lines coming from Rostov through Mariupol in the Donetsk direction, then they could possibly supply 180,000 troops, which will give them a whole frontline advantage of 3 to 1 if the Ukrainians have 60,000 in the Donetsk front, where they are on the defensive, therefore they can leave fewer troops. This whole thing requires a lot of logistical planning, which we haven't really seen evidence of the Russians concentrating a large enough force at one point of the front line to prove that they're able to launch or concentrate 180,000 troops at one point of the front line. However, we will see if that will happen sometime in the future. The point being, if the Russians want to launch an offensive operation where they actually take territory rather than this positional fighting and battle of attrition, then they need to concentrate a lot more troops than the opponent in one section of the front line. And this is again why the Ukrainian sub-offensive failed, because on top of the huge fortifications the Russians had built, the Ukrainians simply did not have this 3 to 1 advantage and much less firepower advantage. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.